Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into, well, a really pivotal and frankly pretty complex chapter in Australia's history. We're talking about the dismantling of its White Australia policy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating subject, especially when you think about the Australia we see today. So vibrant, so multicultural.
Absolutely. It stands in such stark contrast, doesn't it, to these older policies that were, explicitly designed to keep non-European immigrants out.
It almost feels like two entirely different countries.
It really does. And what's fascinating here, one of the most striking things, is that the end of this policy, its dismantling, it wasn't just one single event.
Right.
And it wasn't driven by just one thing. It was a complex mix, global pressures, definitely economic necessity, big social changes happening inside Australia, and, a kind of moral evolution too, maybe a reluctant one at times.
And we're basing this discussion on some solid material.
Yeah, our source for this deep dive is a detailed report from a ChatGPT policy and history analyst. It really covers the origins, how it was enforced, how it started to decline, and then the final repeal.
Okay, so our mission today is to really get our heads around how Australia shifted from these, well, white walls, essentially, to opening its doors.
Huh?
This policy, it started right back at the beginning of the Federation, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901.
Right at the start.
And its goal was incredibly blunt, wasn't it? Keep Australia predominantly Anglo-Celtic European.
Explicitly so, excluding Asians, Pacific Islanders, pretty much anyone non-European.
And the main tool they used was that dictation test.
Ah, yes, the dictation test.
Which couldn't be given in any European language. It was notoriously manipulated just to make sure people failed.
Exactly. Plus outright bans sometimes, and lots of discrimination in the job market.
Just stop and think about that for a second. The difference between that and Australia now, it's quite stark.
It really is. And the thinking behind it back then, the motivations, they were deeply ingrained. It reflected attitudes you saw globally at the time.
Such as?
Well, widespread racial fears, particularly aimed at Asian laborers, often seen as an economic threat.
Okay.
Then there was economic protectionism, trying to protect jobs for white workers, a strong sense of loyalty to the British Empire, too.
Right.
And this underlying belief in, well, what they called racial purity and needing everyone to be the same for social cohesion.
Wow.
These beliefs, you can imagine, they really set the stage for decades of very, very restrictive immigration policy.
But a policy like that, built on such rigid ideas, surely it couldn't last forever. So it started to kind of chip away at those white walls, especially when the world changed so dramatically after World War II.
Well, this raises an important question, doesn't it? How did the world's thinking change after a conflict like that?
Yeah.
The horrors of the Holocaust, for instance, that just threw the terrible consequences of racial ideology onto the global stage.
Hard to ignore.
Very hard. It wasn't just a moral condemnation of racism. It kind of put countries like Australia in a corner strategically, made them face up to how quickly yesterday's racial policy could become today's international embarrassment. And at the same time, you had colonized nations demanding independence, demanding equality.
Right. The post-colonial era was dawning.
Exactly. And Australia, now a member of the brand new United Nations in 1945, suddenly found itself under a spotlight, facing criticism for its discriminatory laws, especially when human rights conventions were being voted on. It was uncomfortable.
That's a really powerful point, the global pressure. It wasn't just moral pressure, was it? There were big geopolitical factors at play.
Oh, definitely.
Australia was in a bind. It really needed to build strong alliances in Asia, to counter communism.
Major concern, though.
Absolutely. But how could it do that effectively when its own immigration policy was so deeply racist? It completely undermined its credibility in a region full of non-white populations.
The irony is huge.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting. Australia's own economic and security needs, meeting those Asian partners, actually became a key force in dismantling the very racial barriers it had built.
And alongside those moral and geopolitical pressures, you had Australia's own economy basically forcing its hand.
How so?
Well, after the war, reconstruction efforts meant there was a massive labor shortage.
Yeah, the populate or perish idea.
Exactly. That initially favored Europeans, but the supply from Europe started to dry up.
Oh.
So purely pragmatically, they needed workers. Didn't matter so much where they came from anymore. The economic engine just needed people.
And it wasn't just about needing bodies for manual labor, right? The economy itself was shifting.
Precisely. Australia's economy started getting much more tied up with Asia, Japan first, then later China.
Makes
It
sense.
just became, well, untenable. You can't maintain racist immigration policies while you're desperately trying to build trade relationships and tap into huge Asian markets.
Doesn't work.
No. And by the 1960s, there was also a clear need for skilled workers. So, quietly, they started letting in certain non-European professionals. Pragmatism was really starting to win out over the old ideology.
So the outside world is pushing, the economy's pulling.
Yeah.
What about inside Australia? Were people's attitudes changing too? Was society itself making the policy harder to maintain?
Yes, exactly. It wasn't like a switch flipping overnight, but there was definitely a gradual internal shift.
Okay.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the earlier waves of European migrants who weren't Anglo-Celtic Greeks, Italians, Yugoslavs.
Yeah, they'd already started changing the mix.
They had. They diversified the population, created a degree of cultural pluralism, which kind of laid the groundwork for broader acceptance, maybe made people a bit more open to
And then the
difference.
60s and 70s happened.
Right, an era of growing social liberalism everywhere, really. Australia was part of that civil rights movement, so
Yeah.
focus on Indigenous recognition, feminism gaining ground. All these things challenged old assumptions.
And amid all that social change, political leadership obviously became critical in actually dismantling the policy.
Absolutely crucial. You had Harold Holt, the Liberal PM in '66. He took some early steps, allowing non-Europeans considered distinguished to get permanent residence.
A crack in the door.
A crack, yes. Then Gough Whitlam, Labor PM, 72 to 75. He took really decisive action in 1973, just removed race entirely as a factor in immigration policy.
That was a big moment.
Huge. And what's really interesting is that his successor, Malcolm Fraser, who was a Liberal PM from 75 to 83, he didn't roll it back.
No.
No, he actually continued the multicultural project, famously welcomed Vietnamese refugees, institutionalized non-discriminatory migration.
Right. I remember the Vietnamese refugee intake being significant.
Very. And that led to the Australian Population and Immigration Council formally adopting multiculturalism as official policy in 1978.
So a cross-party consensus was emerging, more or less.
You could say that. And just to weave in some other key dates, that infamous dictation test, it was pretty much abandoned in practice by 1949.
Oh, that early.
Yeah. Then the Migration Act of 1958 formally got rid of it as a legal requirement. And after Whitlam's 73 changes, you get the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975, which put more legal weight behind the anti-discrimination stance.
So it was a step-by-step process, over decades, really.
Brick by brick, dismantling the old structure.
Now, looking back, we see the benefits, but I bet at the time, this huge shift wasn't exactly welcomed by everyone. What kind of pushback was there? What were the fears?
Oh, you're absolutely right. There was definitely a backlash. You heard it from conservative circles, nationalist groups. They genuinely feared Australia was losing its identity.
What kind of concerns did they voice?
Things like breakdown of social cohesion, worries about crime rates increasing, competition for jobs, driving down wages for, the existing population. These were debated quite loudly in the media, in politics. It was heated.
So given that resistance, how did public opinion eventually shift towards greater acceptance?
Well, partly it was just the reality on the ground. Immigrant communities arrived, worked hard, were very family-focused, generally peaceful. A more positive story started to emerge, countering the fears.
So experience trumped prejudice to some extent.
To some extent, yes, and the success stories helped enormously. Think about Asian Australians, for example, doing really well in education, starting businesses, contributing significantly in healthcare.
Yeah.
That really helped to reshape the sort of national image and demonstrated the actual benefits diversity could bring, made it harder to keep arguing against their presence based on old stereotypes.
And the demographics just kept changing.
Absolutely. By the 2000s, more than 1 in 4 people in Australia was born overseas. And today, despite ongoing debates, because these things are never fully settled,
Of course.
debates about immigration levels, racism, integration challenges, Australia is still often pointed to as one of the world's most successful multicultural societies. It's a living identity, constantly evolving.
So looking back at the whole arc, what were the big strategic consequences for Australia in ditching that policy?
Well, the implications were massive, really, across the board.
Geopolitically.
Huge improvement. It seriously strengthened ties in the region. Think ASEAN, APEC. boosted Australia's international reputation dramatically. You couldn't be a credible partner in Asia with that policy still in place.
Makes sense economically.
Access to a much wider pool of skilled talent, which the economy needed. And it definitely helped trade diplomacy, especially with Asia becoming such an economic powerhouse.
And socially.
Created this incredibly rich cultural diversity we see today. But also, yes, brought ongoing challenges, making integration work, tackling pockets of xenophobia and racism. Those are still real issues.
And finally, morally and legally.
It brought Australia into line with global human rights norms. It had to happen eventually, and it laid the foundation for all the modern anti-racism laws within Australia itself.
Right. So if we boil it all down, what's the main takeaway for you, the listener? It seems this huge shift, dismantling the White Australia policy, wasn't about one single thing.
Not at all.
It was this powerful, almost unavoidable convergence of factors. Practical needs, changing principles, and that undeniable pressure from the rest of the world.
Exactly. You had this deeply embedded racial ideology that slowly, sometimes painfully, gave way to a new understanding. An understanding shaped by pluralism, by economic needs, by geopolitical reality.
Yeah.
And while the scars of that policy are still part of Australia's history, getting rid of it absolutely marked the beginning of a much more inclusive, much more globally connected nation. It really did transform Australia.
And maybe here's a final thought for you to ponder, building on that profound transformation. If a country like Australia could fundamentally redefine something as core as its national identity, shedding a policy that was so deeply ingrained for so long, all because of this mix of global and domestic forces, well, what does that suggest about the potential for radical change in any society, maybe even our own, when similar pressures start to build?